When I was rushed to the hospital after a bad fall, I thought my family would be there. But when I opened my eyes in the hospital room, there wasn't a single familiar face around me. No calls, no flowers, only the cold indifference hanging heavy in the air. They had decided I was no longer needed, no longer worth the trouble. But what they didn't know was this. That very night, as I lay there alone, I made a decision, a quiet, deliberate decision that would change everything. And when the time came for the documents to be read, they faced a shock they would never forget. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Margaret Campbell, and I was 68 years old the day everything changed. I had spent my life as a nurse, first in the bustling city hospital of Portland, then later in a quieter clinic in Salem, Oregon, where life moved slower and people still knew their neighbors by name. After retiring 5 years ago, I had settled into a rhythm that suited me, gardening, volunteering at the local library, and watching the world drift by from my sun-drenched porch. That morning had started like any other. The early September sun slanted low through the kitchen window, painting everything in a warm, sleepy light. I had made myself a simple breakfast, scrambled eggs, toast with a touch of marmalade, and spent an hour watering the plants on the back porch. There was a crispness in the air that hinted at the coming of fall, and I smiled at the thought of pulling out my favorite sweaters soon. Inside, the house smelled faintly of lemon polish and cinnamon, remnants of yesterday's cleaning spree. I decided it was the perfect day to tackle the attic, a project I had been putting off all summer. There were old boxes up there, filled with memories I hadn't touched in years. Harold's high school trophies, Sarah's finger paintings from kindergarten, my own nursing school diploma, still framed in cracked walnut wood. I fetched the stepladder from the garage, feeling a little silly about my determination to handle it all myself, but I had always been independent. Even after Harold passed away, even after Sarah and the grandkids moved 3 states away, I managed on my own. I set the ladder beneath the attic hatch and climbed carefully, one step at a time, ignoring the slight twinge in my knees. The attic door swung down easily, and I pulled myself up into the dusty space, coughing slightly at the musty air. The light bulb overhead flickered to life with a stubborn hum. I spotted the box I wanted, tucked into a far corner, and made my way toward it, careful to step only on the wooden beams. I worked slowly, sorting through old photographs, worn quilts, a collection of Harold's fishing gear I hadn't had the heart to part with. An hour passed before I realized how tired I had become. My knees ached, and my lower back screamed in protest every time I leaned forward. I decided to bring one last box downstairs before calling it a day. Balancing the cardboard container in my arms, I backed slowly toward the ladder. My heel found the top rung, and I began my descent, inch by cautious inch. I don't know exactly what happened next. Maybe my foot slipped. Maybe my balance faltered. Maybe the box shifted just enough to throw me off center. All I know is that the world tilted sharply, the edges of the attic hatch spinning past my vision, and then there was nothing but weightlessness, followed by a jarring, searing impact. Pain exploded through my left side, radiating outward like a shock wave. The box crashed beside me, spilling decades of memories across the floor. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't think, could only lie there gasping, blinking against the sharp, intrusive light overhead. Somewhere in the haze, I became aware of the throbbing in my hip, a deep, bone-deep ache that made my stomach churn. Instinct told me something was broken. Years of nursing had taught me the language of injuries, and this was no simple sprain or bruise. I struggled to reach for my cell phone, which had fallen from my pocket during the fall and now lay just out of reach. Every movement sent fresh bolts of pain screaming through my body. Tears blurred my vision as I clawed my way toward the phone, finally clutching it in trembling fingers. I called 911, my voice barely more than a croak, and managed to give them my address before the pain overwhelmed me again. The paramedics arrived quickly. They were kind and efficient, speaking to me in low, reassuring tones as they stabilized my leg and lifted me onto the stretcher. I clutched Harold's fishing cap in my hand, a ridiculous thing to hold on to, but I couldn't seem to let it go. As they loaded me into the ambulance, the reality began to sink in. I would need surgery. I would be laid up for weeks, maybe months. I would be vulnerable. But through the fog of pain and fear, one thought rose above the rest. A comforting thought at the time. Sarah would come. She would bring the grandchildren. She would sit by my bed, holding my hand, telling me silly stories to make me laugh through the hurt. Derek would grumble, but he would show up too, because family did that for each other. That belief cradled me through the ambulance ride, through the hurried rush of the emergency room, through the cold sting of IV needles and the dizzying haze of X-rays. When they wheeled me into a hospital room, small, sterile, and humming with quiet activity, I kept glancing toward the door, expecting it to swing open any moment, to see Sarah's worried face peeking through. But hours passed, and the door stayed closed. Nurses bustled in and out, adjusting monitors, checking vitals, offering polite professional smiles. The sky outside shifted from afternoon gold to bruised purple, then to the deep, indifferent black of night. Still no one came. I drifted in and out of sleep, the morphine dulling the sharpest edges of pain, but not the sharper ache gnawing at my heart. By morning, I realized that the belief I had clung to, the certainty that family would always come when needed, was as fragile and broken as the bone in my hip. And somewhere deep inside, something began to harden. A realization, a reckoning. They had left me alone, but I would not be helpless, not anymore. The hospital room seemed even colder the next morning. The sterile white walls reflected the gray light of dawn, making everything feel bleached and thin, like a photograph left too long in the sun. I lay still, feeling the stiff weight of the blankets over my legs, the ache of my broken hip, a steady, dull roar beneath the haze of medication. The nurses came and went in quiet, practiced rhythms. They adjusted my IV drip, checked my vitals, murmured questions about my pain level. I answered with nods or simple words, conserving my energy. My body was tired, but it was the hollowness inside me that exhausted me more. Every time the door swung open, every time footsteps approached down the hall, a tiny flicker of hope would leap in my chest, only to extinguish itself with a painful hiss when it was just another nurse, another orderly, another stranger with a clipboard. By mid-morning, I realized I was waiting for something that was not going to happen. No visitors, no flowers, no calls. I turned my head slightly on the stiff pillow and stared at the empty chair beside my bed, the one they always place there for loved ones. It sat there like a monument to my loneliness, a reminder of what should have been and wasn't. Across the hall, I could hear laughter. A large family had gathered in another patient's room, their voices bright and musical, overlapping in that chaotic, affectionate way that families have. I heard a little boy asking if he could push his grandma's wheelchair. I heard a daughter explaining a new recipe she had tried. I heard a man's voice, probably the patient's son, joking that he would sneak in pizza because hospital food was a crime. The sounds were a knife, carving deep into the soft places I had thought were protected. I turned my face away from the door, blinking hard against the sudden sting in my eyes. Memories floated to the surface unbidden. Sarah at 6 years old, climbing into bed with me on Christmas morning, squealing about presents. Sarah at 14, sulking because I made her stay home and study instead of going to a party. Sarah at 21, in her cap and gown, tears of joy streaming down her face as she hugged me tighter than she ever had before. I had been there for every scraped knee, every heartbreak, every triumph. Where was she now? I tried to be reasonable. Maybe she was busy. Maybe Derek needed the car. Maybe the kids had soccer practice or a school project or any number of things that felt urgent in the moment. Life was complicated. I knew that. I had lived enough of it to understand how easily good intentions got swallowed up by everyday demands. But reason couldn't drown out the truth. If they had wanted to come, they would have. If I had mattered enough, they would have been here. The realization settled over me like a heavy blanket, suffocating and cold. The nurse came in with my lunch tray, a pale piece of chicken, a scoop of mashed potatoes that looked more like paste, and some sad green beans swimming in tepid water. She set it down with a sympathetic smile, asked if I needed anything else, then slipped out again. I didn't touch the food. Instead, I stared at the window, watching a crow strut along the ledge outside, its black feathers glossy in the weak sunlight. It paused, cocked its head at me, then took off in a flurry of wings. The silence after it left felt absolute. Around noon, I tried calling Sarah. The call went to voicemail after 2 rings. I left a message, my voice careful and light, saying that I hoped she was all right, that I would love to see her if she had time. I didn't mention the pain. I didn't mention the loneliness. I wrapped my need in politeness and sent it off like a fragile paper boat on a stormy sea. Hours passed. No reply. Later, a nurse brought in a tablet, offering to help me video chat with family if I wanted. I thanked her and said no. I couldn't bear to sit there, staring at a blank screen, pretending not to notice when no one answered. By evening, the laughter across the hall had quieted. Visitors drifted away, promising to come back tomorrow. The hospital corridors emptied, and the world outside faded into darkness. I lay there, listening to the hum of machines, the distant rattle of a cart being pushed down the hall, the muffled announcements from the nurses' station. The loneliness was a living thing now, curling in the corners of the room, pressing against my ribs with invisible hands. I had given them everything, my time, my support, my sacrifices, and when the moment came that I needed them, not for money, not for favors, just for presence, they had vanished. Maybe they thought I would always be there, a permanent fixture, unchanging and eternal. Maybe they thought they had time. But I knew better now. I knew how quickly time could run out. Lying there in the dark, I made a decision, not out of anger, not even out of hurt, but out of a cold, clear understanding. I would not wait for them anymore. I would not beg for scraps of their attention. If I was going to rebuild my life, it would be on my terms, and it would start tonight. The empty room had taught me something no lecture, no argument, no pleading could have. It had taught me that sometimes you have to close the door yourself, not to punish others, but to protect what little of yourself you have left. The next morning, a thin light seeped through the hospital blinds, painting pale stripes across the polished floor. I lay awake long before the nurses made their rounds, long before breakfast carts rattled through the hallways. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the steady beep of the monitor beside my bed, feeling every second stretch out endlessly. The pain in my hip was manageable now, dulled by medication, but the pain inside me had sharpened overnight, honed into something cold and clear. The silence of the room pressed against me, and for the first time, I did not push it away. I let it settle into my skin, into my bones, into the spaces that had been hollowed out by years of misplaced expectations. It was in that silence that the realization struck, not like a slow dawn creeping over the horizon, but like a lightning bolt, sudden and blinding. They did not forget me. They chose to stay away. It wasn't a matter of busy schedules or poor timing. It wasn't about emergencies or accidents. It was a choice, deliberate and cruel in its casualness. They chose their convenience over my need. They chose their comfort over my pain. And in doing so, they had shown me exactly where I stood in the hierarchy of their lives. I thought about all the years I had spent stitching their lives together with invisible threads, babysitting grandkids at a moment's notice, writing checks to cover bills they couldn't pay, cooking meals, offering advice that was rarely heeded but always expected. I thought about holidays spent hosting when I would have preferred to rest, birthdays remembered with gifts chosen carefully and paid for out of a shrinking pension, encouragements whispered over coffee cups during their moments of doubt. None of it had been enough to buy a visit when I was broken and alone. None of it had been enough to warrant a single bedside vigil. The weight of that truth settled heavily on my chest, but beneath it, something else stirred. It wasn't anger, it wasn't even sadness, not in the way I had expected. It was clarity, sharp, invigorating, undeniable. All my life, I had believed that love meant giving without keeping score, sacrificing without expecting anything in return. I had built my worth around being indispensable, invisible in my support, but ever present in my loyalty. And I had taught them, through every silent accommodation, that I would always be there, no matter how little they offered back. But love without respect wasn't love at all. It was servitude. It was erasure. I thought back to Harold, to the quiet dignity he had carried through life, the way he had looked me in the eye whenever he thanked me for something, even something small. He had seen me. He had valued me. I realized now how rare that gift had been, how easily I had assumed it would be duplicated in the generations that followed. I turned my head slightly on the pillow and looked at the leather-bound journal that sat unopened on the bedside table. It had been a gift from Harold on our 40th wedding anniversary, a place to write dreams, he had said, for all the adventures we hadn't yet taken. I had written in it sporadically over the years, lists of places I wanted to visit, recipes I wanted to try, books I wanted to read. After Harold's death, the entries had become more wistful, more hypothetical. Now, looking at it in the cold morning light, I saw it differently. It wasn't a ledger of lost possibilities. It was a blueprint. It was a reminder that my life wasn't over simply because others had walked away. It was a declaration that I still had choices. I shifted slightly, grimacing at the sharp tug in my hip, and reached for the journal. My fingers brushed against the soft leather, and for a moment I simply held it, feeling the weight of it, the promise of it. Then I opened it to a fresh page. With the hospital pen left behind by a nurse, I began to write, not in the neat, careful script I usually reserved for letters and lists, but in bold, sprawling strokes. I wrote what I wanted. I wrote what I would no longer tolerate. I wrote what I would build for myself, without apology, without compromise. The words poured out of me, raw and urgent, forming a map back to myself. When I finished, I set the pen down and closed the journal, feeling a strange kind of lightness settle over me. It wasn't happiness, not yet, but it was the beginning of something better than happiness. It was liberation. I knew what I had to do next, not out of spite, not out of vengeance, out of a simple bone-deep understanding that my life was mine. That evening, when the night nurse came in to check my vitals, I asked her if she could bring me the hospital's notary public. She looked surprised, but nodded. There were forms to fill out, papers to prepare, calls to make. I would change my will that night. I would redraw the lines of my legacy with the same steady hand I had once used to stitch up wounds in the emergency room, because I deserved to leave behind more than silence and disappointment. I deserved to leave behind a testament to the woman I had always been, not invisible, not forgotten, unbreakable. The hospital corridors grew quieter as the evening settled in. The sounds that had filled the day, the clatter of carts, the soft shuffle of nurses' shoes, the low murmur of visitors, faded into a deep, heavy silence, broken only by the occasional beeping of distant monitors. I lay awake, my heart steady, my mind sharper than it had been in weeks. The decision was made, and now there was only the matter of carrying it through. A little after 9 o'clock, the night nurse, a kind woman named Elaine, slipped into my room with a clipboard in one hand and a small smile on her face. She whispered that the notary, Mr. Harold Bennett, had arrived. She said he would come in quietly so as not to disturb the other patients. I thanked her in a low voice, feeling a strange, steady current of anticipation hum beneath my skin. A few minutes later, Harold Bennett entered the room. He was an older man, maybe in his early 70s, with thinning white hair and a leather satchel slung over his shoulder. His presence was calm, unhurried, as if he understood the weight of moments like this without needing it explained. He pulled up the empty chair beside my bed, the same chair that had sat vacant all this time, and set his satchel on his lap. We exchanged a few quiet words. He asked if I was certain, if I was of sound mind, if I wished to proceed. I answered yes to all of his questions without hesitation. There was no uncertainty left in me, no second guessing. He pulled out a small laptop and a stack of neatly printed forms. The soft glow of the laptop screen illuminated the lines on his face, the kind that come from years of listening more than speaking. As he typed, he asked simple questions about my wishes, about how I wanted to distribute the things I had spent a lifetime building. I spoke clearly, firmly, no hesitation. I left nothing to chance. My modest savings, my house, my personal belongings, all of it would go to causes and people who had proven their loyalty and kindness, not with words, but with actions. I named the local children's library as a primary beneficiary, a place that had brought joy to me and so many others over the years. I designated a scholarship fund for nursing students at the community college, where I had once lectured. I named my longtime friend, Carol Simmons, who had visited me during my recovery from Harold's death when no one else had, as the recipient of my car and a small trust. There were no bequests for Sarah or Derek, no token gifts, no hollow apologies dressed up in legal language. They had made their choices, and now I was making mine. Harold worked methodically, printing pages from his portable printer and placing them in front of me one by one. I read each line carefully, even though my body ached and my eyelids grew heavy. I would not let fatigue steal the significance of this night. Elaine returned quietly with 2 other staff members to serve as witnesses. They stood by the door respectfully, understanding, perhaps more than they let on, the gravity of what they were witnessing. With a hand that only trembled slightly, I signed each page. Margaret Campbell, Margaret Campbell, Margaret Campbell. Each signature was an act of reclamation, a line drawn in ink to separate the woman I had been from the woman I had chosen to become. When the final document was signed and sealed, Harold packed his materials back into his satchel with the same care he had shown throughout the process. He handed me a copy of the documents and placed the originals securely into a folder to be filed properly the next morning. As he stood to leave, he paused, looking at me with a kind of quiet respect. "You've made clear choices tonight," he said gently. I nodded, unable to find words that could capture the mix of sorrow and strength that filled me. He didn't ask for more. He simply tipped his head in a gesture of farewell and slipped out into the hallway, his steps fading into the hush of the night. Elaine came in shortly after to check my IV and tuck the extra blanket around me. She didn't speak, but she gave my hand a brief, reassuring squeeze before leaving me alone again. But it wasn't the same kind of loneliness. It wasn't the sharp, aching kind that gnawed at the edges of your soul. It was a different kind of solitude, a strong, deliberate solitude, born not from abandonment, but from choice. I settled back against the pillows, the signed documents resting on the nightstand within easy reach. Outside the window, the city lights shimmered like a distant galaxy, untouchable and cold. I didn't cry. There was nothing left to mourn, only something new to build. Tomorrow, the hospital would discharge me. Tomorrow, I would step, or be wheeled, into a world where I no longer played the role of silent benefactor to people who saw my love as obligation. Tomorrow, my life would begin again, and it would belong to me, wholly and unapologetically, from the first breath of morning to the last fading light of dusk. The morning after the papers were signed, I woke with a strange sense of lightness, as if a weight I had carried for decades had finally been set down somewhere behind me. The hospital room was still the same, sterile, cold, impersonal, but something within me had shifted. The room was no longer a place of abandonment. It was a place of transformation. I sat up carefully, feeling the stiffness in my hip, and looked over at the nightstand. There, neatly stacked, were the copies of the documents Harold had left me. My new will, my new legacy. I reached for them with hands that no longer trembled. The nurse came in a little after 7, cheerful and brisk, announcing that my discharge papers were being prepared and that physical therapy would arrange an initial home visit later in the week. I nodded, barely hearing her. My mind was elsewhere, running through the details of what needed to be done next. After breakfast, a tray of rubbery eggs and overbrewed coffee I barely touched, I asked for access to the hospital's small business center. Elaine wheeled me down the corridor, her hands firm on the handles of the wheelchair, and left me in front of a simple room with a few desks, a printer, and a computer. I logged in and began typing an email to my lawyer back in Salem, a woman named Teresa Barnes who had handled my affairs after Harold passed. I explained the situation briefly but clearly. Attached were scanned copies of the new will, the notarized affidavits, and instructions for the original document's safekeeping. I told her to proceed immediately with updating the county records regarding my house and to contact the institutions where my modest investments were held. I requested that she notify the new beneficiaries discreetly, without fanfare or premature disclosure. Everything needed to be airtight, final, irreversible. When I finished, I sat back in the stiff chair and let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. It was done. The life I had built, the modest savings, the small but meaningful possessions, the home that Harold and I had filled with decades of laughter, arguments, quiet mornings, and warm dinners, would now go to places that would carry forward something of my spirit, to people who needed a hand, not a handout, to causes that wouldn't forget who had believed in them, not to those who remembered me only when it was convenient. I thought about Sarah and Derek, about the shocked expressions I imagined they would wear when they learned the truth. I thought about the arguments they would have, the accusations they would hurl at each other, the blame they would cast in every direction but their own. And I realized it didn't matter. Their disappointment was no longer my burden. Their anger was no longer my concern. I had lived long enough playing the part of the peacemaker, the fixer, the silent giver. Now I was something else entirely. someone who had taken back the power others had siphoned away piece by piece. When I returned to my room, a discharge planner was waiting for me with forms to sign and brochures about home health care services. I listened politely, nodded when appropriate, and made arrangements to have a medical transport service take me home the next day. I would need a walker for a while, maybe even some assistance around the house, but the thought didn't scare me the way it might have a week ago. I wasn't alone. I had myself. That evening, as the sun set and long shadows filled the corners of the room, I opened my journal again, the same one Harold had given me all those years ago. I turned to a fresh page and wrote a single sentence. My life belongs to me. Underneath it, I began a new list. Small things at first. Take a walk in the garden. Bake bread from scratch again. Finish the novel I had started but abandoned years ago. Visit the coast and watch the sunset over the water. Volunteer at the animal shelter. Host a tea party for the friends who had never asked anything of me but my company. Each entry was a reminder that my days could still be full. Not because someone needed me to fill theirs, but because I deserved to fill my own. When the night nurse came in to check my blood pressure, she glanced at the notebook on my lap and smiled. "Making plans?" she asked. I smiled back. "Something like that," I said. I slept deeply that night, untroubled by dreams. Outside my window, the stars wheeled slowly across the sky, indifferent to human drama, steady and sure in their orbits. Tomorrow, I would leave this place behind. Tomorrow, I would go home, but not to the life I had known before, to a new one I had chosen, one I had claimed, one I would live, fully, fiercely, and without apology. The day I returned home, the sky was heavy with low gray clouds that threatened rain but never quite followed through. The ride in the medical van was bumpy, the kind of jostling that made every crack in the pavement feel personal. When we pulled up to my modest bungalow, I sat for a moment, staring at the front door with a strange mix of dread and relief. This was my sanctuary, but it was also a place that had once been so closely tied to a life I thought I was still living. The driver helped me inside, setting my small overnight bag on the kitchen table before giving me a polite nod and disappearing down the driveway. I stood in the entryway, gripping the handles of my new walker, and let the silence of the house wrap around me like an old quilt. It smelled faintly of lemon and cedar, the way it always had. The clock on the wall ticked in steady defiance of everything that had changed. I made my way slowly to the living room, easing myself into Harold's old recliner by the window. From there, I could see the rose bushes he'd planted so many years ago, now wild and unruly without his careful pruning. The sight made my throat tighten, but I swallowed the emotion down. There was too much to do to get lost in sentimentality. I hadn't been home more than an hour when the first call came. The phone rang sharply, cutting through the hush like a whip crack. I let it ring twice before picking it up, already knowing who it would be. Sarah's voice poured through the line, sweet and strained, full of practiced concern. She apologized for not visiting, said things had been crazy with the kids, with work, with Derek's new business venture. She hoped I was feeling better. She asked when she could come by, and if I needed anything. Her words tumbled over each other, frantic and breathless, like a child trying to talk her way out of a punishment she knew she deserved. I listened, but I did not respond immediately. I let her sit in the uncomfortable space between words, a space she had once demanded I fill with reassurance. Finally, I thanked her for calling and said I was fine. That was all. The silence on her end was palpable. She asked if I had gotten the flowers she sent. I said no flowers had arrived. More silence. Then she mumbled something about a delay and promised to visit soon. I could hear Derek's voice faintly in the background, sharp and impatient, and the call ended with a hasty goodbye. I set the phone down carefully and leaned back into the chair. It wasn't the apology I needed. It wasn't even really about me. It was about guilt. Guilt had finally managed to puncture their bubble of self-involvement, but only because they realized something had shifted, something they couldn't control. Later that evening, the phone rang again. This time, it was Derek. His tone was different. No sweetness, no apology. Just a clipped formality, as if he were making a business call he found distasteful. He asked how I was, whether the doctors thought I would recover fully, whether I needed assistance managing the house. There was a thinly veiled suggestion in his voice, a kind of probing curiosity that had nothing to do with my well-being and everything to do with what my situation might mean for their futures. I kept my answers brief, polite, detached. When he brought up long-term plans and arrangements, I told him I had everything well in hand. There was a pause, heavy with the weight of what went unsaid. Then he asked if we could sit down sometime and review things. He emphasized how important family was, how they all needed to be on the same page. I smiled as I listened, even though he couldn't see it. The page he thought we shared no longer existed. I told him we could talk soon, that I would let him know when I was ready. We ended the call shortly after, his voice tight with frustration masked poorly as concern. In the days that followed, the calls continued, sporadic and awkward. Sarah texted pictures of the grandkids, smiling faces covered in chocolate ice cream, soccer trophies held aloft with pride. She wrote messages sprinkled with too many exclamation marks, trying to convey a warmth that no longer reached me. Derek left voicemails about touching base and future discussions, always wrapped in the language of obligation, never once offering an honest acknowledgement of where things had gone wrong. Each ring of the phone was a tiny confirmation of the choice I had made. Each message was a reminder of the difference between real connection and obligation dressed up in convenience. I didn't rush to return their calls. Sometimes I didn't return them at all. Instead, I spent my days rebuilding my life on my terms. I hired a neighbor boy to help with the yard work. I arranged for a physical therapist to come by twice a week. I ordered groceries online, savoring the small luxury of choosing exactly what I wanted without compromise. And at night, when the calls inevitably slowed and the world grew quiet again, I sat by the window with a book or a crossword puzzle and felt something bloom in the stillness. Freedom, not the freedom of abandonment or neglect, the freedom of self-respect. They had finally noticed my absence, but they hadn't noticed me. And now it was too late. I was no longer waiting for them to come back. I was no longer waiting to be chosen. I had already chosen myself. The day of the meeting arrived with a kind of slow inevitability. The air was thick with the kind of oppressive heat that made every movement feel heavier, and the ceiling fans in my little living room spun lazily, doing little to cut through the humidity. I had spent the morning quietly preparing the space, setting out a pitcher of lemonade and a plate of simple shortbread cookies, as if this were any other afternoon gathering, and not the moment that would draw a permanent line between the life I had known and the life I had now chosen. Teresa Barnes, my attorney, arrived first. She was a small woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and a voice that carried an unshakable authority no matter how gently she spoke. She shook my hand firmly, placed her leather case on the coffee table, and set to arranging the papers she had brought with a meticulous care that I found oddly comforting. Shortly after, Sarah and Derek arrived together, the tension between them palpable even before they crossed the threshold. Sarah wore a strained smile and clutched a handbag so tightly her knuckles were white. Derek came in with that same air of practiced indifference he always wore, when he knew he might be blamed for something but thought he could outtalk the consequences. They barely looked at me. Their eyes kept darting to Teresa, to the thick stack of documents on the table, to the folder that bore my name in neat black letters. We made awkward small talk for a few minutes, sipping lemonade neither of them seemed to taste. Sarah commented on how well the garden was growing this year. Derek asked vaguely about my recovery, not waiting for a real answer before glancing again at the papers. Finally, when the false pleasantries could stretch no further, Teresa cleared her throat and opened the folder. She began to read. Her voice was even, professional, giving no weight to the emotions that cracked and flared across Sarah's and Derek's faces as the contents of the new will were revealed piece by deliberate piece. The house, the home they had assumed would naturally pass to them without contest, was to be sold after my death. The proceeds donated equally to the local children's library and a scholarship fund for nursing students. My personal savings, modest but enough to matter, had been divided between the same causes, with a small but meaningful sum allocated to Carol Simmons for her unwavering friendship during the darkest times of my life. My car, my jewelry, even the contents of my house, every sentimental item they might have considered theirs by right, had been carefully designated to people and organizations that had touched my life with kindness and sincerity, not obligation. Sarah gasped audibly when Teresa read the part about the library donation. Derek's face flushed an angry red, and he leaned forward as if he might interrupt. But Teresa didn't pause. She continued with the quiet, implacable determination of someone who had seen enough ugly family moments to know that the only way through them was forward. When she finished, she closed the folder with a soft but definitive snap. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the slow ticking of the wall clock. Sarah was the first to speak, her voice trembling, half shock, half anger. She asked if there had been a mistake, if perhaps I hadn't understood what I was signing. She said it so carefully, as if tiptoeing around the accusation she clearly wanted to make, that I was too old, too confused, too broken to know my own mind. I met her gaze evenly and said nothing. Derek, less restrained, let his anger bleed through immediately. He accused Teresa of manipulating me. He accused me of betrayal. He asked how I could possibly do this to my own family, spitting the word like it was bitter in his mouth. Again, I said nothing. I didn't owe them explanations. Every opportunity for understanding had been given long before this moment. Every choice they had made, every absence, every careless word, every unreturned call had led us here. They looked at me now as if they were seeing a stranger. And in a way, they were. I was not the woman who had spent years bending herself into smaller and smaller shapes to fit their needs. I was not the mother who waited by the phone, desperate for a scrap of attention. I was not the grandmother who plastered on a smile while feeling invisible at family gatherings. I was Margaret Campbell, 68 years old, widow, nurse, friend, survivor, and now the architect of my own legacy. Sarah eventually stood, tears glistening in her eyes, but anger stiffening her spine. She said she needed time to process everything. Derek muttered something under his breath, something cruel and cowardly that I chose not to catch. They left without another word. The door closed behind them with a finality that felt less like an ending and more like a beginning. Teresa packed up the documents with professional efficiency, pausing only to place a warm hand on my shoulder as she left. I sat alone for a long time after that, the evening light casting long shadows across the living room. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. What I felt was peace, the kind of peace that comes from knowing you have spoken the truth, not with words, but with actions. The kind of peace that comes from no longer begging to be seen, but from seeing yourself clearly and deciding that it was enough. Outside the window, the roses waved gently in the evening breeze, wild and beautiful, untamed and thriving. And so was I. The morning after the reading of the will dawned cool and bright, the kind of day that carried a hint of autumn, even though summer technically still clung to the calendar. I woke earlier than usual, the house steeped in an unfamiliar but welcome silence. There were no appointments to keep, no strained conversations to brace myself for, no obligations looming overhead. For the first time in years, I felt like the day belonged entirely to me. I made myself a pot of coffee, strong and dark, just the way Harold had always liked it. I sipped it slowly on the back porch, wrapped in a light sweater, watching the light crawl across the garden. The rose bushes danced in the breeze, wild and unbothered by pruning shears or expectations. They grew for themselves, not for anyone else's approval. I thought that maybe I could learn something from them after all. The bitterness I had expected to feel never came. Instead, there was a strange sweetness in the solitude. I no longer needed to justify my existence to people who had treated my love as an obligation rather than a gift. I no longer had to measure my worth against how useful I was to them. I had stripped away the layers of silent compromise, the constant negotiations for a sliver of consideration, and what remained was something far sturdier than I had anticipated. It was me, unapologetically, entirely me. Later that morning, I sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and made a list. Not a list of chores or errands, but a list of things I wanted to do, simply because they made my heart stir. Volunteer at the library again. Take a weekend trip to Cannon Beach. Adopt an older dog who needed a quiet home. Learn to paint, even if the canvases turned out terrible. Attend the Sunday farmers market without rushing. Host a book club for the ladies on the block who had quietly become a new kind of family over the past few months. The list grew longer as the hours passed, and with each new line, the space inside me expanded, pushing out the last lingering traces of sorrow. By early afternoon, I called Carol Simmons and invited her over for lunch. She showed up within the hour, a bouquet of wildflowers in one hand and a box of donuts in the other. We ate on the porch, laughing over stories from our nursing days, marveling at how strange and wonderful life could be when you finally stop trying to mold it to fit other people's expectations. Carol asked if I had any plans for the weekend. I told her I was thinking about driving to the coast, taking in the salt air, maybe even dipping my toes in the cold Pacific if I felt brave enough. She grinned and said she would come with me if I didn't mind the company. I realized I didn't mind at all, not because I needed someone to fill the space beside me, but because I was finally choosing who shared my life, not enduring whoever happened to occupy it by default. As the sun sank lower in the sky, I walked slowly through the house, touching the framed photographs on the mantel, the worn armrests of Harold's favorite chair, the patchwork quilt draped over the back of the couch. These were the remnants of a life well lived, not a museum of regrets. I no longer felt trapped by them. Instead, they anchored me to a history that was mine to honor, not to be buried beneath other people's neglect. In the days that followed, Sarah and Derek sent a few more messages. Tentative, strained, awkward attempts to find footing on a bridge that no longer existed. I responded when I felt like it, with kindness but without urgency. I wished them well, silently and sincerely. But I no longer bent myself into painful shapes to accommodate their discomfort. I was not cruel. I was simply free. Free to love without being taken for granted. Free to give without emptying myself. free to live the years that remained with the same fierce tenderness I had once reserved for everyone but myself. One evening, a few weeks later, Carol and I stood on the edge of the beach at Cannon Beach, the wet sand cool beneath our feet, the ocean stretching vast and endless before us. The wind whipped through our hair, carrying away the last tattered remnants of the old life I had left behind. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply, letting the salt air fill my lungs, letting the steady roar of the waves drown out every voice that had ever told me I was too much or not enough. When I opened my eyes again, the world seemed sharper, brighter. It was not the life I had planned. It was not the life others had assumed for me. It was the life I had chosen, one brave step at a time, and it was beautiful. As Carol laughed and pointed out a group of dogs racing along the shoreline, kicking up sprays of silver sand, I realized that I had not just survived the loneliness, the betrayal, the abandonment. I had transcended it. I had become something stronger, something wiser, something impossibly, beautifully whole. And standing there, with the ocean singing its endless song before me, I promised myself that I would never again ask permission to be happy. I would live, fully, fiercely, on my own terms,